I am Karen Robinson. I will be the chair of this session today, and I am the host of a podcast called Democratically 2020. We've been following the US election on our podcast for 2 years since we launched in 2018 as primarily 2020, and we covered the US Democratic primary. I also have a long career, or I guess a long history at least, of working in democratic politics. I was the regional field director for Americans abroad on the first Obama presidential campaign. In my professional life, I work as a communications planner and strategist for Edelman UK, and I was twice vice chair of Democrats Abroad UK. So I come at this whole conversation from a very Democratic Party point of view. And I'm absolutely thrilled to say that we have an amazing panel today. John Halpin is joining us. John is a senior fellow at the Center for American Politics. He focuses on campaigns and elections, political ideology, and public opinion. Halpin has been at the Center for American Politics, American Progress, since all the way back in 2003 when the organization was first formed, and he serves as the co-director of its politics and elections program. Now, if those of you in the room who follow American politics closely will know that the Center for American Politics is an absolutely brilliant organization that does great work. I also have in the room Emily Thornberry, who I'm sure will be infinitely familiar to many of you. Emily is, of course, a British politician. She's been a member of Parliament for Islington South and Finsbury since 2005. Of course, she's a member of the Labour Party and served as Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade since 2020, since all the way back to last year. And finally, he's not quite in the room yet, but we're hoping that we will be joined shortly by Marcus Roberts, who is the Director of International Projects at YouGov. Marcus previously worked for the Labour Party in the UK and for the Democratic Party in the US, and for a bunch of think tanks and campaigning groups across Europe and America. So has obviously a very informed perspective on the race. Before I kick off, I think the format of the session today is going to be each of us will say a few words, our thoughts on the election, what we thought was a standout from the election, what, if any, lessons the Labour Party and the left in Europe can learn from that. And then at the end, there will be a Q&A. So you will all have your opportunity to weigh in with your thoughts and questions. If you look on the left-hand side of your program, you will see a little chat box with a question mark in it. Click the question mark to ask your questions, and I will select the questions to be asked. If you want to just have a general conversation or commentary, please use the one above that, the sort of ordinary chat box for general conversation. So without further ado, I think we'll kick off. I'm not going to speak at length. I've got a few minutes, but I did think I would spend a few minutes to just set the scene of the election as it was, because this election it's been something. I think as a general rule, it's fair to say, given the events that we've seen recently in the Capitol, that America is at a turning point with this transition of power from Donald Trump to the Biden administration. It's at a dangerous moment. We've had multiple overlapping crises hitting us at the same time. There's been a crisis of trust in institutions, from the media to the courts to the electoral system itself. Over the summer, we saw a perhaps overdue crisis of racial reckoning through the Black Lives Matter movement. And of course, the pandemic crisis has reshaped the way that we live, while the climate crisis is undermining our confidence in the future. And of course, throughout all of this, the thing that has been front of mind for many of us is that the president himself and his followers have been testing, I would say, the entire American democratic system almost to breaking point, culminating in the violent takeover of the Capitol building that we saw last week. But I don't want to talk about that today, because today I want to talk about the things that Democrats should be excited about, and the joy that the domestic terrorists have been trying to steal from us, because Joe Biden's victory was both impressive in its own right, and it was impressive because it marked the years of hard work that Democrats and Democratic allies have been putting in around the country. I hope that today we'll have a chance to talk about the wonderful work that's been done in Georgia, led by Stacey Abrams and her brilliant team, leading up to, of course, the two crucial Senate victories in Georgia of Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff. I hope that we'll be able to talk a little bit about Ben Wickler and his team, who organized in Wisconsin to overturn a critical state for us that we had lost in 2016 and took back this year. I hope that we'll have a chance to talk about the fact that more women, more young people, more minorities around the country are not only getting more involved in politics as organizers and activists in America, but also crucially are standing for office themselves in bigger numbers. I think it's also worth noting that the divisions within the party itself, between Bernie Sanders-style progressives and more moderate Democrats like Biden himself, so far has not, touch wood, torn the party apart or turned into the kinds of division that many feared. And in fact, Biden's team has been working closely with this wing of the party to revamp his climate policy. So some of those differences, of course, remain, and they may burst out into tensions during the Biden administration. But right now, things are fairly harmonious in the Democratic camp. So I guess entering into the Biden administration, possibly no president since the Great Depression has had such a long to-do list. But I think the best news of all may be that whilst the country has serious problems, through the good work of organizers around the country, we've earned ourselves a chance to start solving those problems. And I think that's going to be really interesting and hopeful to see in the coming years. And with that said, I'm eager to hear more about the details of what went on during the election and some further thoughts about kind of electoral process and campaigning tactics. So I will hand it over to John Halpin.
Thanks, Karen. And good afternoon, everybody. Good morning from Baltimore. Emily, it's nice to be with you and meet you. So I think the questions that were given were, what were the key factors that explain the Democrats' success? What did Trump do right, even though he's a complete disaster and a moral monster? And then what are some of the lessons for the future? So I'll just take those in order to give you some insight about the election period, which actually seems like a whole nother period, a whole nother era, because of the post-election period and the insanity of Trump denying the realities of the election and the violence we saw last week from far-right militia types. So it's a little odd to just talk about the election given the democratic crisis we're having, but I'll do my best to give you some insights about why this worked. Okay, your context was a great overview of something that could have drastically gone wrong for Democrats. I mean, Joe Biden got maybe 15% in Iowa. He was not going to be the Democrats' nominee, even though he probably needed to be. During the primary period, there was this big division you mentioned. The Democrats spent a year debating the finer details of single payer versus other types of healthcare, other sorts of ideas on immigration and climate, where there really was a split between the left and the more center elements. And this got resolved in Biden's favor. And you're right to say that the party coming together in the face of Trump is the first thing we have to realize mattered for success here. And I think this worked for Biden because Biden from day one said he was going to restore the soul of the nation. And everybody said he's washed up and he's like old hat politician, but he instinctively got what was necessary to build a big coalition to beat Trump. And so he made this a battle about character and values, the decency of the American people versus the immorality and rot of Donald Trump. And, it could have been a different battle. It could have been a battle about big structural transformations and other things. And quite honestly, if Trump wasn't such a bad candidate in many ways, that may have failed. And, Trump made a lot of poor decisions in this campaign, but he did have a lot going for them, which I'll get to in a minute. The second thing that Biden did well, he focused on pragmatic policies on the two biggest challenges facing the country that Trump had failed on: the pandemic and the subsequent economic depression. Trump chose to go into full-on culture war. Biden stayed front and center on the pandemic and the recovery. And it worked, especially coupled with the values overall that he was pushing. The other thing that happened was that it was not clear. Marcus and I talked about this a lot prior to the election. It wasn't clear that the Democratic campaign was going to work. Joe Biden barely left Delaware. There was no traditional ground campaign. We were doing all this mail-in voting. We did not know if it was going to work. So it was a huge gamble to just do digital organizing and hope that text messages and emails and other things like that would get Democrats out to vote and to make sure they understood how to use the mail-in voting process and all of this. And it was not a given that this would work. So huge props to the Biden campaign and the Democrats overall for figuring out a way to campaign digitally at a distance in the middle of a pandemic. And we could talk some more about how that worked. So what did Biden do? Biden won 51.4% of the vote, 306 electoral votes. He flipped the old Rust Belt states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and picked up Arizona and Georgia, two more diverse emerging states. There really wasn't a formula for this. Like crunching all the numbers, the individual level data is quite bad. We're still trying to get some better survey research on this. But if you look broadly at the geographic patterns, it looks like Biden and Democrats made small widespread gains. And that's what needs to be conveyed from this, that there wasn't one single group. Everybody keeps saying it was suburban voters. And suburban voters certainly matter, but they're a diverse group to begin with. They're not just white college educated women. There's a whole bunch of people in American suburbs. So what we found looking at the data is that Biden, particularly if you look at a state like Pennsylvania, made small widespread gains in the Philly suburbs, in Pittsburgh, but also in places like Scranton, where he's from. He ran this famous Scranton versus Park Avenue kind of populist thing here. So I think that's important. And the overall pragmatism and values enabled Democrats and Biden to pull together a solid wide coalition. Now, it's probably not that deep. And I think this is something we'll get into in the Q&A, that it clearly didn't translate into down ballot success as much at all. The Senate, we got lucky because Trump was such a nightmare that we got the Senate back from great campaigning and candidates in Georgia. But there were a lot of Senate seats that we were expecting to pick up that didn't happen. The House, the House, we lost ground. We have a very narrow majority going into this new Congress. It's far different than when Obama took over. So there are a lot of questions about what the Democratic Party needs to do outside of the national vote to get a better, deeper coalition. People keep asking about Trump's 74 million voters. I think it's important to say Trump failed. I mean, Trump could have won this campaign had he had an ounce of decency and foresight to try and deal with the pandemic in a decent way, to not launch culture wars. He clearly had something that resonated. He chose to run a campaign strictly on anti-BLM, anti-socialism, anti-lockdown. And it had some appeal, obviously. It picked up some support in South Florida with Hispanic voters and parts of Texas. I think the lockdowns are a big part of this. They're underestimated as part of Trump's success. I think at the state level, a lot of people were not happy with some of the more stringent lockdown requirements, as necessary as they might have been. And the other part about Trump's success, he was an incumbent president and a Republican, and a lot of Republican voters overlooked his deficiencies in terms of character to say, well, he did all right for us on the economy. He got us some judges. He did things we wanted on immigration. So I think that explains it. But really, Trump barely improved his vote. I mean, there was a huge turnout surge on both, but he still ended up with just 47% of the vote. So he really did not do much to reach out. And then just finally, what do Democrats need to do going forward? I think there is a brand issue that came out here, and Joe Biden kind of papers it over because he's an old school kind of FDR Democrat. The sort of professional, highly educated face of the Democratic Party does not work in many parts of the country. Some of the obsessions of the cultural left really do not work if you're trying to go into places that are redder and meaning more conservative. It's something to keep in mind. I mean, you have to have a vision grounded in traditional democratic and American values, and that's what Biden did, not strange academic jargon and other things that just turn people off and confuse them. What do Democrats need to do, and what might be useful for the European left and center left? Well, the first thing, obviously, for Biden is to move fast and go big. This is not an austerity moment, and Biden just unveiled a third stimulus package that's more than twice as big as the Obama one when he was vice president, dealing with the financial crisis. So this is not a timid administration. Clearly, they want to focus on national recovery, meaning we've talked about it as rewiring the economy, rebuilding the safety net, and reconnecting America with the world. This is the Biden vision for America. He's going to stay focused on it. He's going to do his best to avoid Trump and culture wars, because that's not what we need. We're stuck with 1 hour after he's inaugurated. We're going to start the Senate trial of Donald Trump. So the faster we get rid of Trump, the better for Democrats. But I think the idea is to get back to the sort of Obama optimism about the decency of everyday people doing the work of the country, the basic vision of FDR around the four freedoms, traditional good liberalism in the American setting. And that's what Joe Biden wants to accomplish. And, talk of unity is clearly important, but really Biden needs to just maintain 52% of the national vote. I think the Republican Party is in deep crisis, and the idea that Biden's going to be able to fix any of that is kind of ludicrous. What he needs to do is continue with a positive face, focus on national economic recovery and development, and the well-being of all people. And with that, that's my overview. So.
Great. Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate that. That was helpful. A reminder to everyone, keep hitting those questions in the question box on the left-hand side. Just hit the little cartoon question mark asking box to put your questions in and keep the chat going. I can see a nice, lively chat going in the conversation box as well. Emily Thornberry, over to you.
Okay. It was weird, actually, today. I was in Houston and wandering around in the rain, doing my daily exercise. Of course, it was conference weekend for the Fabians, and I wasn't able to be speaking at that. I had to go home and battle my way onto Zoom and speak to you from there. It's strange times, but it's great to be able to have a happy subject to discuss. I remember that at our online party conference back in September, I chaired the panel on the upcoming US elections with Biden's organizer in Texas and one of his old White House team. They were telling us all, yeah, we got it in the bag. We're going to win by a mile. You could see in the Zoom gallery all these Labour members kind of looking as if, I wish what they were saying I could believe in. I think they're being overly optimistic. Why are they being so optimistic and getting all our hopes up like this? But strangely enough, I was looking back at a speech that I made to Fabian Conference exactly 2 years ago. And I was, if anything, just as confident then myself as the Biden campaigners were back in September. Because I was looking at it and I saw that what I had said that day was that I was pretty sure that Trump was going to be thrown out of office after one term. And I gave a couple of reasons for that. First, I think I got largely right, but I have to confess, the second, I got largely wrong. The first was I said that in 2020, the politics of hatred would not work the way that it had in 2016, because I said it is one thing to trade on the politics of fear and division and disillusionment when you're challenging for office and offering change. When you're challenging, there's quite another thing to do when you're the actual leader in charge. All you can offer is more of the same. And I think that this was both entirely correct and something that Joe Biden countered with huge skill in his own constant messaging of healing and unity. My second argument back in January 2019 was not right, and it's important to understand why. When we look at the lessons of Trump-Biden for the European left, and what I said was that the voters and the states who had delivered victory for Trump in 2016, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, would turn their backs on him when the solutions that he had promised to the problems that they faced turned out to be empty rhetoric and lies. That's where I went wrong. Because I went wrong thinking that the US election would be in any way about problems and solutions or a debate about policy. Because in my view, it ended up being about none of those things. It was, by Trump's own design, a referendum on Donald Trump. Even incredibly, whether his entire handling of the pandemic and the hundreds of thousands of American lives that have needlessly been lost as a result of his action be waved away because he personally had survived COVID. And so he deliberately, in my view, turned the election into a choice about whether you stood with him or against him, whether you accepted the crude and naked lie that supporting him was the equivalent to supporting America. And the stark reality is that when he turned it into a referendum about himself, the vast majority of those Trump 2016 voters in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan backed him again in 2020, along with almost 1 million more from across those three states. And we know that Trump still lost all those three states, and Georgia and Arizona too, because voters turned out in even bigger numbers, record-breaking numbers, to reject continued division and hatred, to reject Trump's vision of America, and to reject Trump personally, and also to endorse an opponent in Joe Biden who offered an entirely different type of presidency and represented an entirely different vision of America. Let me tell you what the main lesson that I've learned from watching Trump Biden and thinking about future elections in and in Europe, where populist Trump imitators in positions of power will find themselves, hopefully. They will find themselves, hopefully, against strong progressive alternatives. And I was wrong to think that Donald Trump will be found out when he offered people the same diagnosis of their problems, but could only offer the same empty solutions that he had done the first time round. What I was forgetting is that actually the first rule of populist leaders, once in office, they're no longer trading on the politics of problems and solutions. They know that leads nowhere for them. But what they end up trading in, and we saw this with Donald Trump, is the idea that they personally personify the nation. If we love our country, then we must love them. And if we don't, what does that make us? There's no surprise that this white supremacist mob who attacked the Capitol last week, the politicians and pundits who incited them, spoke in terms of patriots fighting for Donald Trump and the traitors who were betraying him. We have seen this all before in Europe, from Louis XIV to Silvio Berlusconi. While I personally don't think that Boris Johnson would ever have the gall to present himself as the personification of the state, what we know for sure is that he is happy to resort to the idea that anyone prepared to criticize the money he wasted on test and trace, on his failure to recruit enough customs agents for Brexit, is guilty of running down the country or failing to believe in Britain. So while we have a way to go until the next election, the mountain to climb when we get there, I think one of the most immediate lessons that we need to learn from the American elections, and the real example that Joe Biden taught us, is don't let a populist leader define what the country believes in or stands for. What I think is, when I think back to Joe Biden in the presidential debates, what I remember time and time again is what he would say, this phrase. He would look straight down the camera to American voters and point at Donald Trump and say, this is not who we are. This is not who we are. And whatever else we do in the next 3 years, there is a huge amount that we have to do to win back the trust and the voters which we lost. One thing we must do is we have to set out a positive vision of who we are as a country, the values and instincts that we hold in common, the collective sense of that we all have about what's right and what's wrong and what's fair and what's just. From the contents of a family food parcel to the cuts to universal credit. And we must do it clearly, and we must do it with confidence, and we mustn't pull our punches. And we must point at Boris Johnson and this wretched government and their cronies and their dismal record. And we must say to the British people in every debate and in every sense, this is not who we are.
Thank you very much for that, Emily. The question of who we are and what we stand for, I think, is fundamental on both sides of the Atlantic to how we position our politics. Since Marcus Roberts hasn't quite managed to show up yet, I think he's said that he'd be here around 4 o'clock, having been delayed. We'll give him another couple of minutes to arrive. While we do that, why don't we just kick off, because I'm going to take the chair's privilege and direct one or two questions to the panelists that are burning in my brain. John, I want to start with you, because as you alluded to in your talk, although Biden won the presidency and won it pretty clearly and convincingly, if not quite as overwhelmingly as many of us expected, we did much less well than expected in the congressional races, especially in the House, where we were expected to gain seats but actually lost some seats. I'm hoping you can just talk a little bit about the mechanics of how that happened. How did we get to that point? Was it, different types of voters who perhaps Biden appealed to that were not attracted by the party overall? Or was it, more of a structural problem? And how concerned should Democrats be about that going into the next election cycle?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think all the party strategists are trying to figure this out, because we have 2 years before we're trying to buck historical norms when the incumbent party, presidential party, tends to lose a lot of House seats. Sometimes this doesn't happen. This happened under Clinton. But the part of it starts with the fact that the Democrats got their House majority back in places that Donald Trump won. So they won a bunch of seats that they probably had no business winning, and they were marginal. And regardless of people's disdain for the president, his lack of character, his failure on the pandemic, there was this sense that if we don't block the Democrats, we're going to get this overwhelming socialist agenda. It'll be nonstop political correctness. They'll sort of beat us down. And I think this was the running narrative of Fox News, all of right-wing media, every single candidate running for government on the House side and in the Senate. That's all they talked about. And so I think it had an effect. And it clearly that broader conservative appeal probably picked off some of the Hispanic voters in Florida and Texas and places like that. And then more traditional places where Democrats had gotten fortunate to pick up new votes, people were probably nervous about what Democratic majorities meant. So this goes back to my point about the Democratic Party's brand problem. And it's not seen as a party of the people anymore. It's seen as a fairly elitist party. And Joe Biden papers this over because he talks in plain language, and he has strong, decent values. He's got a long history with the country. He was Obama's wingman. Like, people trust Joe. But beyond that, a lot of people don't trust the Democratic Party. And this isn't just a fiction of the right. It's some of the things they choose to do upset people. So you saw some pushbacks on hypocrisy around the lockdown. So Democratic states had all these lockdowns, but then you'd see their officials out going to restaurants and things of this nature. This happened in the UK as well, from the Tory side. They made big stumbles on this stuff. But if you're going to lecture people about public health and then you violate it yourself and you go do something else, people are going to think you're hypocritical. I think people underestimate the negative side of the protest over the summer. So we were having a big battle about a second stimulus plan. The House had $3 trillion on the table. And we spent the entire summer talking about the nature of BLM protests. Are they violent? Are they not violent? And it could be hyperbole, but there was always a proof point. And a lot of the research we did a study with Puerto Ricans in Florida. It came up naturally. They're like, I'm nervous about what's going on out in Seattle, in Portland, and in Chicago, and places like that. I don't want that kind of stuff on in my place. And Democrats just kind of ignored it. And I get it. They, racial equality is a core part of what they want, and most of the protests were peaceful. But it opened the door for this belief that the Democrats basically embraced their own form of radicalism. And I think that had some effect on the down ballot races, and particularly in places that are more conservative traditionally. And I think that probably explains some of the inroads with Hispanic voters, Asian voters, and Black men. And the party needs to reconcile this somehow. Now, it's not going to happen now because of what just went on, but we've got to stay focused on general, liberal values of racial equality, not strange theories about the United States is a hopelessly racist state. So that's the other thing that went on all summer long, was people affiliated with the movement constantly talk down the country. It's a racial caste system, it's a white supremacist superstate. And we have real problems with far-right white supremacist groups that we have to lock down. But the left tends to make the statement so general as to dilute its power as a unifying force against extremism. And this is just something that we've been trying to get people back to an inclusive version of patriotism built on traditional FDR-style liberal values. All people are born free and equal in dignity and rights, like the Declaration of Human Rights. Various big liberal statements. And I don't know whether the party will do this because of Trump, and I don't think the Senate trial is going to help things as much as I think it's warranted. He should be convicted. I don't see 17 Republicans signing up to convict their own president. And I'm afraid that the early days of the Biden administration are going to be consumed by old battles over Trump, moving beyond necessary clampdowns on actual white supremacist extremist violence to a broad culture war that is unwinnable for Democrats. And so that's my recommendation about getting back to, the core elements of national recovery and a bigger picture. Politics has to be additive, not subtractive, and it can't be built on culture wars. And a lot of people in the Democratic Party want their own version of culture wars, and I think it's a massive strategic error. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. I am thrilled to see that Marcus Roberts has joined us. Welcome, Marcus.
Hey, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes. Thank you for joining us. I know you were unavoidably detained, but I'm glad you were able to make it. We've just, to catch you up, so all the panelists, bar yourself, have just gone around and said a few words of kind of what their thoughts are, and I think it's your turn next. So without further ado, so a reminder to all of our guests, Marcus Rashford is the Director of International Projects at
Rashford, really? That's the promotion.
Rashford, yes. I've promoted you to footballer status, haven't I? Apologies.
Deputy Leader of the Opposition now.
Marcus Roberts is the Director of International Projects at YouGov and have worked for both the Labour Party in the UK and the Democratic Party in the US. So I think you should have some fascinating insights. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. And firstly, my apologies to be so late. I naively thought that as a new father, I could both babysit and set up my tech for this at the same time. So if you hear loud screams from Lila, our new daughter, in the background, and I run off camera, that's why. So I take this one entirely on my fault. I'm sorry. Firstly, it's a great pleasure to return to the mothership that is the Fabian Society for me, and an honor to be with my ex-boss, Emily Thornberry, as well as a mentor of many years back, John Halpin, whose book, The Emerging Democratic Majority, was on my desk at my very first day at the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee nearly 20 years ago. So it's a real thrill to be here. Thank you. I'll just make 3 points because I'm late, and I'll make them quickly. A point about polling and politics, a point about the attacks of last week, and some things to think about for the future of the Democrats and Labour alike going into the future. The first point is polling and politics. There was a polling problem in the 2020 cycle, and it's important to be honest about that. Whilst we got the election result right, we got down ticket very wrong, and we also got the margin of the Biden win badly wrong too. Now, why was that the case? It looks like, to some extent, that we continue to have in polling a problem of non-response amongst certainly lower income right-wing voters. This problem is compounded by the fact that the political problem that the left has been facing for some time amongst white working class voters seems to be spreading somewhat in the Latino community in America as well. And I wonder sometimes if we should be paying some attention in Europe to a potential decrease in support for left center parties amongst ethnic minority communities of a lower income nature in these countries as well. That's something to think about and worry about for the future. The next point I'd like to make is about the attacks, because the attacks show both the tragedy of American politics at the moment and also the responsibility as well as political opportunity for the Democratic Party. During the attacks, YouGov polled in real time voters of all persuasions in America and found nearly 45% support for the attacks amongst Republican voters on the day of the attacks themselves. We polled the same question again 48 hours later, and we found that support had fallen to 35%. Now that tells us two things. One, it tells us that as news came in of the severity of them, a reasonable chunk of Republican voters, 10 points of them, nearly a quarter of those surveyed in that pool, did change their minds and flip their positions, and that's encouraging. But it also tells us rather worryingly that over a third of Americans still considered at some level those attacks to be acceptable. So that tells us that we need a politics that can A, build on that 10% that did flip, and B, be mindful of the sheer scale of the problem in terms of addressing the 1/3 that didn't. It's really important in this to realize the role that the media plays. The media, in being uniformly condemnatory of the attacks, I'm certain played a very important role in changing those 10 points of Republicans. I see Stephen in the chat just asking 1/3 of Americans or 1/3 of Republican voters. It was 35 points of Americans that comprised the 45 points of Republicans as a whole in that poll, Stephen. And I'll happily post the link to it with the Fabians to circulate afterwards. I'll finish on this, which is some thoughts about what America might have to teach the Labour Party and parties of the left in Europe more generally. And that is very much, as John said, that progressive parties need a progressive message when it comes to social justice, but it should be an and, not a but. Joe Biden was very, very effective in the campaign at saying he was proudly supportive of LGBT plus rights, but he wasn't there to pick a fight with people who maybe weren't as far along on the journey of LGBT plus rights as he was. So he never stopped talking about his love of LGBT plus people and of his belief in equality amongst those communities, but he didn't go out of his way to say that people who didn't subscribe to the full Democratic platform were in some ways bad people. And that's an important difference in terms of the stress and the emphasis that he placed, because he made it a positive agenda about loving people and around equality, rather than a negative agenda around condemning those who haven't journeyed as far as the rest of us have. That's one thing. Another thing to bear in mind that is really important here is the difference between what is happening amongst working class voters and what is happening amongst middle-class voters of higher education, higher income. And there again, to really, really hammer home John's point, I'm sure from earlier, even without hearing, I know his politics well enough to have confidence he made this. Unless the left has a strong and clear economic message that speaks to low-income people, that speaks to people who love their towns and loves their communities where they are, and don't want to be told that if they want a future, they have to leave those towns and communities and seek out a city, then the left will continue to lose ground. Indeed, it will create a very dangerous precedent that we're beginning to see the occurrence of, in which high turnout elections are no longer good things for the left. High turnout elections can potentially be bad things for the left if more and more low-income voters become sporadic voters who only show up for the right when they have the opportunity to vote for Brexit or vote for Trump. To address the low-income, low voter turnout challenge, it's absolutely critical that the left has a positive and radical economic agenda that respects the people and the places that they live in order to offer them real hope for the future. And that's where attacking the Conservatives on the failure to deliver levelling up is going to be very important. But even more important is being believable when it comes to offering an alternative vision for those voters in those communities. And one of the final things I would say that perhaps Sir Keir Starmer can learn from Joe Biden on is this, which is the Democratic platform was very radical. It was very, very, very radical. But it was only able to be so radical in areas of social justice and economic progress because the candidate himself was so reassuring. Sir Keir has the opportunity to reassure the British people in much the same way that Joe Biden was able to reassure Americans. And that created a permission structure in which the Democratic platform itself could be as bold and as radical and potentially transformative as it is. And so for those asking for Keir to take more radical tones, I'd say look to the substance of his policy rather than the reassurance of his style. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. That was absolutely brilliant. And I think you've well earned your footballer superstar status there. So apologies again for conflating you with, as you say, the leader of the opposition, Marcus Rashford. We've got only 15 minutes left in this session.
Deputy leader.
We've got only 15 minutes left in this session, and I am keen to get to quite a lot of your excellent questions in the chat box. Before I do, though, I do want to just one more time exert Chair's privilege and direct a question to Emily, because I've been thinking a lot. I'm curious what your views are on the question of coalition building and the learnings from across the Atlantic on that. Joe Biden's electoral coalition comprised everything from, Democratic socialists like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, all the way to Republican leaders such as, former Ohio Governor John Kasich. What do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of such an exceptionally broad coalition? And what, if anything, would you learn from, or perhaps even caution against in that approach?
I think that we have to always remember that one of the extraordinary things about the Labour Party is that our party is unlike, we talk about, the left in Europe, but unlike any other left party in Europe, we are the progressive party. We are the coalition on the left. And that's because of our electoral system. And so we have a coalition on the right and we have a coalition on the left. And what we have to do as a party is make sure that we stick together and acknowledge that any positive change, quite frankly, that has happened in this country is pretty much all down to when the Labour Party is in government. And what we must do always is bear in mind that the Labour Party without power is nothing. We are an instrument for progressive change, and we have to make sure that we win elections. And I personally think that what we need to do is to have some recognition of what a great historic party we are and what we can achieve, and to speak with confidence about that there is another way, that it doesn't have to be like this, that, and just pick up that kind of holding our heads up high. And of course, I understand, I get it, that we are subjected all the time to, a barrage of criticisms and complaints from the right, who have instruments through the media, to continue to have a go at us. And it is very difficult when we have been out of power for the amount of time that we have nationally to retain our confidence. But we have to do that, because what we need to do is we need to be clear and crisp and confident about what it is that we say, and get out there and say it and show that there's another way other than this dreadful government.
Thank you very much. That was, as requested, concise and clear. So I'm just going to go to a few audience questions now. One question that was posted very early on in the chat touches on what we've just been talking about. And with apologies, I'm not going to ask the questioners to come on camera and ask their questions themselves, just so that we can get through a few of them in time. But Dr. D. Dutta has asked, Pew Research found a deep dislike among both Biden and Trump voters for those of the other side. It's clearly true. There's a lot of kind of intense dislike and polarization in America. This was the same in the UK during the Brexit debate, which Johnson exploited. Biden built a coalition of African Americans, Central Americans, Latinos, etc. How do you see this task of perhaps not just building the coalition, but also perhaps overcoming the intense bad feeling that exists across these? anyone who'd like to pick that up, but perhaps Emily, you'd like to have a
Yeah,
first.
I think the point is this, and I was sort of touching on this on what I said earlier, about the politics of division and how much, can be got from the politics of division, but the wheel can turn and does turn. And Biden, I think, is an example of that, of why people are exhausted by this. And what we need to be able to do is to bring people on and say, we've had a period of fighting and division and so on, but look at all the things that hold us together. Look at all the things that they're unifying. And that's what I was referring to, and what I said at the outset, which is, let's define our own Britain. Let's make sure that we go out and make it clear the sort of country that actually we believe that we are. And so long as we speak truthfully, I think people will, they want to move on. And we want to move on. And as I say, I think that we have been through a dark time, and I am quite positive that we're moving away from that now, and that post-Brexit Britain will want to be, coming back together. And of course, the Tories will continue to try to play culture wars. And you can see Boris, in the chamber, desperate to try and constantly find these hackneyed, dividing lines, and we just mustn't rise to it. And we must set our own agenda and our own narrative about what it is that Britain is really about.
Your sound's off.
I'm setting my sounds off, aren't I? That's actually, nobody's yet said you're on mute, but it was hanging.
It's mandatory in a Zoom session. Yeah.
There's a really concise question in the chat box that I wanted to pose to perhaps both John and Marcus. Would Biden have won if it hadn't been for COVID?
I think he would have won, but it certainly helped because Trump, those bizarre press conferences when from March through May, where he would go on these extended rants, and you could just see that he was losing the country. The country would have possibly gotten behind a national leader, even as odious as Trump, if he had an ounce of practicality and empathy. So it really crushed him. I think he scared the heck out of old people. He scared the heck out of a lot of parents. And so it certainly helped Biden get over the hump. But I think ultimately Biden would have won probably the same thing. It wasn't a huge win. It was like 50,000 votes in 2 states would have made it a tied electoral college. But I think Biden was a better candidate than Trump, but so I think he would have won. But yeah, I think it had a huge impact. And the economy was going pretty well. They had an entire huge campaign operation set up to tout the economy, and it certainly had a ding, but it was self-inflicted because Trump chose not to engage on it. He chose to be inconsiderate of Americans' fears and concerns, and it cost him.
Marcus, we can't hear you.
Try again. I'm just trying to help people with their bingo cards. I don't think Biden would have won were it not for COVID, but then I don't think Biden would have been the candidate were it not for COVID. I think that the extraordinary circumstances that delivered the Biden restoration in between his collapse in Iowa and his resurrection in South Carolina was hugely to do with not just with the power of Jim Clyburn and the African American community, but also the very strong interventions of the Obama alumni network and their determination to ensure that the nomination went to the most electable Democrat that the emergency national crisis of COVID was producing, and the unusual situation that COVID produced politically of requiring a calm, steady as she goes, trusted pair of hands leader that Joe Biden, words not necessarily would have associated during some of his career in the Senate, had come to represent by the point of February, in which COVID was becoming so serious a threat, I think created the political opportunity and space for him both to win the nomination and to win the presidency. And I also think at that probably no other Democrat could have won the presidency other than Joe Biden this year.
Yeah. So I've got a question here that I think is interesting. We haven't talked a lot about one of my political obsessions, and which comes up in this question, which is how can we build campaigns for deeper structural issues with our democracies, such as the lack of democratic legitimacy of the US Senate or the need for proportional representation here? Obviously, in the US, we have not just the Electoral College, but a number of other issues that systematically disadvantage Democrats, and it's very difficult to find ways through to actually resolving some of those questions. So what are your thoughts about kind of approaching the reform of democratic political institutions themselves? I'll direct that to John to start off.
I mean, I think they're important and vital, but the reality is we'd have to eliminate the filibuster, which they may try and do over these issues. I don't know, but the problem I see from it is that we shouldn't pitch it as a partisan power play. So expanding voting rights and access to voting benefits everyone, and it's a core American value. We shouldn't pitch it as, hey, we're going to expand the ranks of the Democratic Party, which is what all the Republicans fear. Right now, that may in fact be true, but it may also get balanced out. I mean, some of the expansions of possibly DC statehood and Puerto Rico, you're still going to have an imbalance with the Senate. So I think if you want to get people to do structural change, you've got to ground them in actual democratic values and notions of fairness, equality, ease of voting. You know, the mail-in voting one is an interesting one, because there's no reason why the Republican Party couldn't make a lot of gains with mail-in voting. They have older voters. It's easier to do. The president, and again, another mistake of his, chose to attack mail-in voting, which was a huge error. But I think these structural issues, one, they're hard to fix, and two, we shouldn't make them about partisan power plays from our side. I don't think I'm going to win this argument, because I think Democrats are very upset and may try and shift some things. But I think if you want them to have support and longevity, you want them grounded in basic democratic values.
Can I just say that I think that, I mean, I agree with all of that, John. And I think that the lesson in the UK is we have to remember that the Tories are picking up very much the right's playbook when it comes to trying to disenfranchise. How many examples do we have of voter fraud in the UK? I mean, they are using it as an excuse to make our voters make it more difficult for them to vote. And, surely a democracy is based on the idea that everybody has a right, and indeed should be encouraged, and it should be made as easy as possible for everyone to have their say, and how important that is. Because as a citizen, you have an opportunity to have some power. It's only a little bit of power, but collectively, in the end, you are in charge, because you can vote, and also because you're on a jury and you are the only ones who can be trusted to judge your peers. So both of these things are really important. And the way in which we have not embraced, the 21st century when it comes to identifying people, getting people on the voters register, and encouraging them to be able to vote in whatever ways they want. So it seems to me, I mean, I remember in the mayoral election, I think it was when Sadiq stood, and there was a massive increase in the number of people who suddenly wanted to vote. And in my constituency doubles in size during the day because of the number of people who, in the good old days when we used to go to work, would come into Islington and vote. And lots of them were coming up to me and saying, "Where's the polling station?" And they came from all over London, and I had to explain to them they weren't allowed to just vote in the local polling station. They had to go home. And where was their people didn't even know this. And we just make things more difficult for getting people to be able to vote. First and foremost, above everything else, when it comes to a democracy, get the people to vote and make it easy for them. And don't allow anyone to put forward counter arguments to that and get away with it and somehow or other think that it's okay. It most definitely is not okay. We are all equal.
Amen to that. We're coming up towards the end of our time. I think we've got just a few minutes left. So before we go, I'm going to take a couple of questions that are forward-looking future questions and just pose them to everyone in the panel. So there's a question about, do we think impeachment in the Senate is going to be damaging going forward? Is that a problem? I think, John, you've started to touch on that. And then also somebody had asked the question whether a potential Trump run in 2024 might be something that could be a problem even here in the UK as we approach the next general election. So I guess all three of you, if you just want to say a few words about kind of what you're looking at going forward and what you expect the near-term future to hold in terms of those things and whatever else you want to say as a final sign-off. I'll tell you what, Marcus, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So I don't think Trump will be running again in 2024 either because he is convicted in the Senate, less likely, or more likely there's some kind of legislative compromise, possibly around a censure motion to strip him of the specific right to run for office. That might be something that could carry the support of 17, might well be something that could carry the support of 17 Republican senators, not least of all because it's very much in Mitch McConnell's interests that Trump no longer holds a gun to the Republican Party's head for the next 4 years, let alone in 4 years' time. So I don't expect to see him run again at that point. And the other point I wanted to just pick up on was the previous thing about democratic institutions, the democratic reform agenda for the left. I just wanted to say this. The left loves to talk with great reason about better electoral systems and better constitutional and devolution arrangements. And at a time when people are really suffering from a health crisis and really suffering from an economic crisis and from decades of globalization that have left tens of millions of voters behind, it leaves people cold in their hearts when we do this. If we're going to have a constitutional and political reform agenda, which we absolutely should have, it needs to be something that has relevance to citizens in their real lives. It needs to be about putting power into their hands, either in economic power in terms of giving them rights to be workers on boards, rights to have worker representation on pay committees, power within local communities on how to spend their money rather than have it taken away by central governments that constantly cut welfare and constantly cut infrastructure and constantly screw parts of the country that aren't called London. So all of that needs to be considered in the form of a new political reform agenda for the left that isn't just technocratic, because that's going to have to wait for another day.
John, any thoughts on the future from you?
So, my wish for the party in 2 years or 4 years is that people think of Democrats as the party that tried to get everybody in America a job and everybody healthcare, and started to take on the climate challenge and started to repair America's image in the world and worked on public health and pandemics and poverty. That's what I want the image to be. The longer we deal with Trump or we obsess about Trump, the worse it's going to be. I don't know whether they'll be able to bar him from office or not. I don't actually know. I think impeachment was warranted. He should be convicted. He's a scourge. And if ever impeachment was created for anything, it's for this. The problem is the voters already tossed him. He's gone. He's gone in a few days. So there's some questions, some constitutional questions about the legality of something going forward. I don't have all the answers to this. And hopefully Schumer and company make this thing happen quickly, because the bigger picture for Democrats holding the House, maybe trying to expand their Senate ranks and holding on to the presidency over in 4 years is what I said before. Everyone has a job. Everyone's got access to healthcare. The country's booming. Our standing in the world is up. We're standing, we're competitive with China. We're taking on the nation's problems, and we've moved beyond the insane reactionary populism of Trump. And let the Republicans crash on Trump. I mean, that's going to happen. It's going to be ugly, and I don't know where it's going to turn out, but we don't need to be a part of that. I mean, we've spent all this time obsessing with Trump. It's time to move on, and I think that's big. So,
brilliant. And finally, Emily, what are your thoughts about the future?
Well, I think the things that I'd like to say is, the first thing is that despite the onslaught on American institutions, they have survived, and that's that is to the credit of the United States. Actually, how much was Trump able to do compared to what his agenda was, and what held him back? But he did incite a racist mob to attack the Capitol. I mean, it's hard not to say you shouldn't impeach the so-and-so. But anyway, but I hear what people say. And Biden has potentially just a short window, just a couple of years maybe, when he holds the Senate, when he holds Congress, and there's a Democratic president as well. And there's so much that needs to be done. And what he needs to do, what they need to do more than anything else, is not be afraid and to push forward on a radical agenda and show that actually a vote to the left, a vote for Democrats can make a real difference to people's lives. Don't hold back. That's what I would do. That's what I think he has a golden opportunity to do. And I think that, he will find many people around the world, cheering him on. As I say, I think the wheel has turned.
Brilliant. Listen, thank you all so very much. I've thoroughly enjoyed that. I found it really informative and helpful. Emily Thornberry, Marcus Roberts, John Halpin, how about a virtual round of applause for our brilliant panelists? And thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you for having us.
Nice talking to everybody.
Thank you ever so much,
Karen,
pleasure. Emily and Marcus. Just to let you know, the next talk will be at 4:45, so everybody can have a bit of a comfort break. Thanks a lot again. Bye.